A dia de vestilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. There are deeds that darken the world like a spreading storm. There are seasons when the laughter of men turns into a testimony against them. In such days, one man stood apart, not by cunning or force, but by the simple fidelity of his heart. That man was Noah, called to a work that would mark the earth and the mercy of the Maker. If you will stay with this telling to the end, you will hear not only the story of an ark and a flood, but the weighty lesson it carries for every life and every leader. If this account stirs you, consider subscribing and leaving a like, so more of these ancient narratives may be kept near and pondered. When lawlessness had spread over the face of the land, the memory of the Maker seemed dim in the minds of men. Violence filled the earth. The imaginations of hearts were bent continually toward ruin. In those days, God observed the world He had formed and was grieved. He spoke, and the words were not merely a pronouncement of punishment, but a summons to set apart what was righteous. Noah was of a different temper. He lived in the steady rhythm of obedience and labored in the quiet faith that listens for the voice above the noise. He was described by those who knew him as blameless in his generation, walking with God, language that suggests not moral perfection as though made of stone, but an ordered life that turned toward God as a practiced habit. He had a house, 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the ordinary domesticity of a world about to be overturned. One night, when stars seemed like a sealed curtain above him, Noah received the charge that would define his days. The command was precise. Build a vessel, an ark, of gopher wood. Make it in compartments, pitch it within and without. The dimensions given were not small. They would require years of labor, a community of hands, and a stubbornness of purpose that would outlast the mockery of neighbors. Along with the structure, God outlined a mission. Bring into the ark the living of every kind, pairs of beasts, birds, creeping things, so that seed might live upon the earth. The mandate carried urgency and a strange hope. Though judgment would sweep like a flood, life would be preserved through faithful obedience. Noah rose. He called his sons and spoke plainly of the labor ahead, of the measurements and the pitch, of closely fitted planks and vaulted ribs that must bear much weight. Shem, Ham, and Japheth took axes and adzes and set their shoulders to the timber. The work stretched seasons into memories. Trees were felled from distant groves, sawn and squared, the scent of fresh-cut wood mingling with tar. Neighbors paused and watched, then smiled, then mocked. The sound of laughter followed them like a train. Where will this vessel float? Is he building a house for himself, or a ship for a land that has no sea? Such questions were not merely rhetorical. They pressed upon the faith of Noah and his sons as a test. Around the building site, the world kept its ordinary commerce. Merchants bartered, shepherds moved their flocks, but the air carried a nervy incredulity. Prophets, if any still spoke plainly in the towns, were hushed or dispersed by scorn. Temple rites continued in forms now hollowed by ritual, and men offered what they pleased while justice slept. In that climate, Noah's labor stood out like a lamp in fog. The ark's progress was visible in days and years, ribs rising one by one, a wide keel laid as if for a sea yet unseen, rooms and roofs fashioned to hold the great covenant of life. Noah pitched the vessel within and without. The smell of pitch, bitter and solemn, clung to those who worked. It became a place apart, both practical and sacred, for it was built at God's word. Neighbors grew bolder in their derision. Some hurled insults, others brought questions in jest and anger. Noah answered in the steadiness of a man who has received a command. The Maker has told me, we will do as he bids. When the appointed time neared, the animals came not by men's dragging, but by a strange order. Pairs of beasts, some familiar, some men only saw and named in passing, arrived with an odd submission. Lions and cattle, birds of the air and creeping things, each in the number set before Noah. There were clean beasts in larger number, and others by sevens or by pairs, according to the instruction given. People watched and were struck. Some moved to a silent wonder. Others shrugged it off as servant trickery or the work of exotic traitors. But the ark filled. Outwardly an immense storehouse, inwardly the seedbed of the future. When the last plank was set, and the great door was sealed by God's direction, the heavens remained still for a moment that felt like held breath. Then the rain began, not first in torrents, but in sheets that darkened the roof and saturated the soil. It came for 40 days and 40 nights, a ceaseless outpouring that would not be numbered as ordinary weather. Springs of the great deep were broken up, as if the very foundation of the world had yielded water. The flood rose and covered the high places. The ark rode on the face of the waters. From within, the ark was a narrow universe, the low light that came through small openings, the murmur of animals in their stalls, the close work of tending and feeding, the daily prayers of Noah and his family. Sleep was measured by the creak of beam and rope, by the sound of waves striking the sides, by the animal breathing that mingled with human sighs. There were days of watching, sonnets of fear and gratitude braided together, when hunger and compassion were both present and required governance. Noah learned the temperament of each beast. His sons learned this utterly practical stewardship. The ark was no mere refuge. It was a community in miniature, where order kept death at bay, and fidelity kept hope alive. Outside the vessel, the flood swept away the conveniences of men as easily as chaff. The mockers who had jeered at the shorer's craft now found no higher ground to stand upon. The water took ruin and city, field and altar, with the awful impartialness of judgment. Yet the account, even as it records devastation, keeps its modesty of detail. The focus remains on the moral truth rather than on the spectacle of suffering. The narrative thus gives dignity to those lost, avoiding prurient description. Their fate becomes a solemn lesson about the direction of hearts. Time on the waters passed with numbers that humbled the mind. The rain lasted 40 days, months flowed. At last the rain ceased, though the water remained, and the great deep began to retreat slowly. Noah opened a window and sent forth a raven. It flew and returned, flying through water and land, finding no perch that would hold. Its wandering a small emblem of a world in search. He then sent forth a dove. The dove found no rest and returned. Later it returned with an olive leaf plucked in its beak. and hope moved like a whisper among the sleepers of the ark. On the next release, the dove did not return, and Noah's heart recognized the sign. The water had gone down from the earth. The ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. When at last Noah opened the door and set foot upon a changed soil, the smell of wet earth rose up like a benediction. The sight of the world was altered. Tarnished, yes, but also renewed. Noah built an altar and took of the clean beasts and birds and offered burnt offerings upon it. The act was not one of triumphalism, but of reverent acknowledgement. God had preserved a remnant to steward creation forward. God smelled the pleasing offering and made a solemn covenant. He spoke in terms both juridical and tender. Never again would he curse the ground for man's sake, nor destroy all living things by a flood. As a sign of this promise, he set a bow in the clouds, a token between creator and creature. From the vault of heaven the colors would arc, a visible reminder that the Maker's judgment is not finality, but can be bound to mercy when men turn. Noah and his family stepped into a new world, scarred by judgment, yet charged with stewardship. They planted vineyards, tilled the fields, and learned again the slow arts of growing and bearing fruit. The narrative does not pretend that the moral order was instantly restored. The record even traces new failings that follow from old wounds. The covenant did not erase consequence. Families bore long memories. Nations would yet falter and repent, reap and suffer. This tension, the coexistence of mercy and the persistent weight of consequence, becomes a constant note through the generations. Yet the story's central claim remains stark. A single household's obedience rooted the future of the earth. Where lawlessness had multiplied, one life that walked with God served as a hinge upon which mercy turned. Think on the way that obedience and mercy met in that vessel, and how such union must be lived out again and again in human hearts. Among the first signs that mercy did not erase the ache of sin were the intimacies and fractures within Noah's own house. The narrative tells of a night in which Noah, having planted a vineyard and made drink of its wine, lay uncovered within his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and went forth and told his two brothers. Shem and Japheth, covering their father with reverent care, though walking backward so as not to behold him, preserved a decorum that Ham had set aside. When Noah awoke and learned what his youngest son had done, he pronounced a curse upon Canaan and blessings upon Shem and Japheth. This moment is small in its telling, yet large in consequence. It shows how the stain of the world's violence did not vanish with the waters. It had lodged now in households, in gestures of honor and shame. The curse and blessing fall like seeds into the soil. From them would sprout earthly destinies, rivalries, claims to land, and the shaping of nations. The text does not make easy the question of culpability. It simply records that human failure, even within the vessel that had been saved, bears fruit. Mercy had preserved life, but it had not purified human hearts at a single stroke. Families would continue to bear the consequences of their choices, and history would be partly the story of how those choices multiplied. From Noah's sons, the chronicler unfolds a map of the earth. The table of the nations sets names beside regions. It names the founders and traces the spread of peoples across the face of the ground. Japheth's heirs spread to the coastlands, Ham's to the lands of the south and west. Shem's line would be counted among the ancestors from whom the chosen people would later be numbered. In that catalogue, there is no simple moral hierarchy placed upon the names themselves. Rather, the list is a geography of human dispersion, an acknowledgement that the world now would be many-tongued and many-voiced. Out of that dispersion came both promise and peril. Men who had learned cunning and craft in the days before the flood now set themselves as builders of cities. They grew in number and in confidence. With technique and labor, they raised walls and towers. It is here that the drama of Babel unfolds. The people, moving eastward, said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Their purpose, plain in the telling, was a kind of self-preservation turned to self-exaltation, unity without reverence, security without deference. The response of the Maker is both severe and measured. Thus, the arc that began with the pitch and timber of the ark bends into the long sweep of human history. There are seasons of outward rebuilding, of houses, vineyards, cities, and there are seasons of inward repair, of conscience, covenant, and law. Against the easy optimism that would pretend structure alone secures good, the post-flood story insists on moral formation. Against the despair that the brokenness is irredeemable, it insists on covenantal patience. Both claims must be held. So, the chronicle of the early peoples closes upon a world populated and plural, a world where the Maker's promise and mankind's proclivity for sin coexist. The rest of the book moves from maps to families to callings, from the sons of Noah to the arks of Abraham's call, to the gathering of a people set apart. The covenant with Noah is thus both an ending and a beginning, an ending to universal destruction and a beginning to particular election. It teaches that God will preserve a people to whom further revelation will be entrusted. It teaches that human stewardship now bears renewed moral weight. Before that further unfolding comes to view, pause on the pastoral import for the hearer. If mercy and consequence walk together in the early pages of human history, then your life, too, is a place where those two truths must be held. You cannot ignore the brokenness you inherit. You cannot also deny the scope of God's forbearance. Care for the small things, private honor, household discipline, fidelity to one's calling, as though the order of nations rose from such common practices. Resist the seductive promises of unity formed by self-exaltation. Instead, seek unity formed by humility, service, and obedience. The narrative now turns its face toward a man called from Ur of the Chaldees, a call that will concentrate in one family the hopes of blessing for all nations. But the memory of ark and tower, of curse and scattering, will continue to hum beneath that call. The covenant that preserved life at the flood will now find a particular channel through which mercy will move with greater definiteness. The drama will grow closer, more intimate. Promises will be made to a single household. Faith will be tested in wandering. A seed will be waited for across generations. And so we follow the story, watching how God's patience and humanity's frailty continue to intertwine, how the work of obedience, small, tedious, often mocked, remains the medium by which mercy is extended and life preserved.
The next scenes demand attention to the way a calling reshapes a family, and how a family reshapes the future of nations. There the question will be posed again: who will build the vessel of mercy, and who will set up a tower for himself?
Brothers in blood sometimes argued over waters and grazing. The field does not always teach concord. Yet Abram moved forward. His concern turned again and again to the one center promised: a land, a seed, and a blessing to the nations. And so the pilgrimage carried both promise and discipline. Each stage of the road required a remaking of the family's memory. Where once the fathers had worshipped by household images, Abram now built altars to the one God who had called him. Where once their identity had been measured by clan and craft, it began to be measured by covenant and mission. This remaking was slow and uneven. Old patterns yielded only under long pressure, and new patterns had to be taught at the hearth as well as declared from the heights. The narrative remembers these domestic acts for a reason. The making of a people is not a single dramatic moment, but a succession of small obediences. The teaching of children to speak of God at the table, the discipline to depart when departure is commanded, the courage to receive the stranger, the humility to return to a place of dependence. Abram's life gathered such moments into a pattern that would shape the destiny of a family, and through them the hopes of many nations. At times, the text pauses to make a covenantal move more formal. The Lord appeared to Abram and solemnly bound himself to a promise uncertain in human eyes. The ritual of this binding was not of human kingship, but of solemn pledge, an oath and a sign, words laid upon the future. It was as if the Maker stooped to tie his name to the promise of an heir, to stake his faithfulness against the frailty of men. Such a covenant does two things. It commits God's mercy to history, and it summons the heart of the called to a trust that will endure seasons of drought and of plenty. Thus, Abram's wandering acquired a theological depth. He did not walk only to inherit land. He walked to embody a truth about the God who gives life to dead hopes. Wherever he pitched his tent, he bore a summons to faithful waiting. His household, imperfect and often anxious, stood none the less as the first sign that a people might be shaped by promise more than by power. And within this household the figure of Sarai grows in dignity. Though the annals speak little of her inward speech, she is present as the woman who sustains the tent, who keeps covenantal memory, who gives to the pilgrimage a mother's steadiness. The history will later show her wrestling with barrenness, with reputation, with the yearning for a child. In those struggles, she will teach what faith looks like in the place of deep longing. Her life and Abram's life will be braided. Their decisions will shape not only their own name, but the names of nations to follow. So the caravan moved onward, sometimes with haste, sometimes with the measured prudence of a household that must reckon with weather and with the law of neighbors.
They passed through fields that would later be called by other names. They saw the hills that would be measured by later generations. In every stopping place, Abram marked the ground. In every passing, he left a witness that his life was ordered to more than comfort. The march from Ur to Haran and then from Haran toward the promised land becomes a theological geography, a map of trust rather than of soil. The text insists that the heart of the matter is not the place but the promise, not the table but the faithfulness feeding it. Nations are formed, the story suggests, when households dare to order the small things of life under the weight of a great hope. And so the chapter that signals this call closes upon the image of a man on the road, his household about him, the sky above vast and patient. He hears, he moves, he waits. In such movement a little seed is placed, a household pledged to shape the future by faith. The weeks and years ahead will press upon that seed, sieges of doubt, eruptions of conflict, the hard schooling of patience. Yet the promise holds, and the covenant bends history toward a people who will learn in slow and ordinary ways to make mercy and judgment walk together. Thus, having seen Abram's first steps and the shaping of his household, the chronicle turns to the next tests and revelations that will further define them, the calls that come at oak and altar, the quarrels over flocks, the strange visits that bring laughter and astonishment. The road remains open, and the God who called will continue to speak in ways that press the family toward the destiny promised so long ago. And it came to pass, as the caravan pressed deeper into the land, that famine rose upon the face of the earth. The harvests failed in the fields where Abram had pitched his tent, and hunger weighed upon the household like a cloud. Prudence moved him to go down into Egypt, for the famine was grievous in that region, and bread was there to be had. He went therefore with Sarai and all that he had, and with him Lot his brother's son. The sojourn in Egypt proved a trial of a different order. The customs of strangers and the courts of foreign rulers pressed close upon them. Sarai's beauty became a matter of peril. Abram feared lest for her sake men should slay him and take her. He framed a plan born of anxiety. He said that Sarai was his sister, and so she was taken into Pharaoh's house. The household was spared of violence only at the cost of exposure to another power. Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake, and he received flocks and herds and servants. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai. In the night the truth bore its own witness, and Pharaoh called Abram and said, "Why didst not tell me that she was thy wife?" He reproved him and commanded that they go forth with all that they had.
Thus they departed from the land of Egypt, rich in cattle and in silver and gold. But they carried also the memory of a fear turned to deceit. It was a school in which Abram learned anew the cost of trusting human wit more than divine keeping. Returning northward, Abram journeyed to the place between Bethel and Ai, where formerly he had made an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. There he built again an altar and worshipped. He named the Lord who had kept him in the trials of famine and foreign courts. Such acts, returning to the place of worship, setting up the stone, lifting the prayer, are small stitches by which the fabric of faith is mended after strains upon it. As the household prospered, so also did its flocks multiply, and with increase there came a difficulty. The land could not bear both Abram's cattle and Lot's cattle when they remained together. Strife arose between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot.
Abram, mindful of the charge laid upon him, and unwilling that dissension should mar the covenantal witness, spoke with a generosity that revealed his heart. He said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, nor between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself from me. If thou take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if thou take the right hand, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld the plain of Jordan, well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, even as Egypt toward Zoar. And he chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and journeyed eastward, and pitched his tents toward Sodom. Thus Lot separated himself from Abram, and Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. The separation showed a divergence of hearts. Abram's life remained bound to the promise and to altars. Lot's chose the allure of fertile ease, a choice that would lead his tent toward cities whose reputation was bleak. Time marked the wisdom of Abram's restraint like a slow justice. For, when the kings of the plain rose in rebellion and war spread, it was Lot who was taken captive, carried away with the spoil and the people. Tidings of his capture reached Abram, and the tidings stirred in him a courage that was not of sword alone, but rooted in the loyalty of kin and in the trust that God's purpose was not to be foiled by the violence of men. He armed his trained servants, born in his house, 318, and pursued the captors by night. The suddenness of the march, the breaking of the enemy's encampment, the thunder of pursuit, all these scenes the record keeps brief, as one who wishes the fact to speak for itself. Abram smote them, and recovered all, and brought back Lot with his goods and his women. Upon Abram's return, there came one whose presence bends the narrative toward worship.
Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God, brought forth bread and wine, and blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, who hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. Abram gave him tithes of all. The meeting stands like a hinge. Warrior and worshipper meet, and the war is set within the orbit of blessing. Abram's act of giving a tithe is both gratitude and recognition that victory and provision are not his by right, but by grace. His sword returns into the hand of the one who is above kings. After these events, the Lord spoke unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. Abram answered with the plaintive question of one who looks at his life and counts the cost. Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? The Lord led him forth and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. He promised that Abram's seed should be as the dust of the earth, innumerable. Yet Abram, who had wandered, and who had endured famine and the test of deception, asked the Lord for a sign. It was then that the Lord appointed a covenant. The text describes the making of the covenant in a ceremony at once solemn and strange. Abram was commanded to bring certain animals, to cut them in two, and lay the halves opposite each other. And when the sun went down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, there came a horror of great darkness. In that sleep, the Lord foretold the sojourn of Abram's seed.
They would be strangers in a land not theirs, and would be afflicted 400 years. But that nation which sojourned would be judged, and Abram would come forth with great substance. At the closing of the vision, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp passed betwixt the pieces, signifying the binding of an oath. The Lord set himself to the promise in such a manner that Abram perceived the steadiness of God's purpose against the flow of human time. These scenes, the test of famine, the tension with Lot, the rescue, the blessing of Melchizedek, and the vision of the covenant, do not read merely as heroic episodes. They form a moral and theological school. Abram learns where his trust must finally be placed. The household learns what being a people of promise requires. The landscape itself, heaped with altars and graves and memorial stones, becomes testimony to a patience that waits on God's timing. The household will yet be tested in the intimacy of the tent, and Sarai's barrenness will press upon both their names like a question to be answered by heaven. In the hush after revelation, before the next scene unfurls, the narrative lingers over the small practices. They build an altar, they call upon God, they set their hearts to trust. And so the road continues, but now the pilgrimage carries the weight of promise more tangible than before.
Abram walks under stars whose counting has been commended of him. He carries the memory of battle and the taste of victory that arrives through obedience. He bears the blessing of a priest-king who points the man's triumph back to the Most High. The household waits, and the ages of waiting press upon their daily bread. Within the tent, Sarai wrestles with hope and scorn, with the laughter that will one day break like prophecy, laughter both bitter and blessed. And Abram will be tested where the promise most intimately intersects with the body and the blood of his house. Thus the chronicle, faithful to its slow economy of shaping, moves toward the intimate trial that will teach what covenant means, not in altars, but in the naming of a child. The next days will bring rosterings of doubt and of wonder, visits that seem impossible, and the laughter that is both scorn and song. The story keeps its counsel a while longer, that the reader may feel the hush before the altar of the next revelation. And Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an handmaid of Egypt, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram dwelt in the house of Abram, and Hagar conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Wherefore Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled from the presence of her mistress into the wilderness. She went and set herself by a spring in the way to Shur, and the heat of the day pressed upon her, and her heart was heavy within her. But the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, at the way to Shur. And he said unto her, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel added,
Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and thou shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar returned unto her mistress, and she did according to the saying of the angel. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Abram was 60 and 16 years old when Ishmael was born unto him.